In 1968, a cheerful and deeply religious young woman named Anneliese Michel began experiencing something no one could explain. It started with a single terrifying seizure that seemed to come out of nowhere. But what followed was far worse, a descent into behavior so disturbing, so unrecognizable, that those closest to her feared something far beyond medical science was at play. Anneliese claimed she could see ghostly faces, hear sinister voices, and feel the presence of countless demons inside her. Terrified for her soul, her parents made a fateful decision. Instead of relying on doctors, they turned to the Catholic Church, pleading for an exorcism. What unfolded would shock the world and become the inspiration for one of Hollywood's most chilling films. But the true story? It's far darker than anything you've seen on screen. The story begins on September 21st, 1952, in the Bavarian town of Leibelfing, Germany. Josef and Anna Michel welcomed their second daughter, Anneliese. Over the years, the Michel household grew, with 3 more daughters joining the family: Gertrude, Barbara, and Roswitha. Anneliese and her sisters were raised in a devoutly Catholic household. Josef, her father, had once considered becoming a priest, and 3 of her aunts were nuns. The family attended church services religiously and prayed together daily. But the Michel family carried a dark secret that would profoundly shape Anneliese's life. 4 years before Anneliese was born, her mother, Anna, gave birth to an illegitimate daughter named Martha. This event brought shame upon Anna, so much so that on her wedding day to Joseph, she was required to wear a black veil. From an early age, Anneliese was burdened with guilt she hadn't earned. Her mother encouraged her to pray fervently to atone for the sin of her illegitimate birth. When Martha died at just 8 years old, following an operation to remove a tumor, Anneliese's sense of duty to repent for her mother's past grew even stronger. Despite this strict upbringing, the Michel family was financially stable. Josef ran a successful sawmill in the nearby town of Klingenberg, and Anna worked alongside him in the business. Anneliese's deeply religious grandmother also played a significant role in the children's lives, ensuring they were firmly rooted in Catholic teachings. As a child, Anneliese endured several illnesses, including mumps, measles, and scarlet fever. These frequent bouts of sickness caused her to fall behind in school by a year. Nevertheless, she was a diligent student who dreamed of becoming a teacher. Outside of school, she enjoyed playing the piano and accordion. Then, in September 1968, Anneliese's life took a terrifying turn. One day, she briefly blacked out. Later that night, she experienced violent convulsions resembling an epileptic seizure. During these episodes, she struggled to breathe. Her hands became numb, her tongue felt paralyzed, and she lost control of her bladder. Although she recovered quickly, the experience haunted her. A year later, it happened again. When she sought medical help, a neurologist diagnosed her with grand mal epilepsy, known today as generalized tonic-clonic seizures. At the time, Anneliese's health was already fragile. Her tonsils had been removed, and she suffered from pleurisy and pneumonia. By February 1970, she was hospitalized for lung disease and diagnosed with heart and circulatory issues. Anneliese's roommate at the hospital described her as a cheerful, deeply religious young woman with a bright outlook on life. She rarely, if ever, spoke about her illnesses. But in June 1970, things took a darker turn. Anneliese suffered her 3rd seizure, and though she was finally discharged from the hospital in August, her family and friends immediately noticed she wasn't the same. The once vibrant Anneliese had become withdrawn and uncharacteristically quiet. Later, she would recount the harrowing experiences she endured in the hospital. During her daily prayers, she claimed to be tormented by demonic figures that left her overwhelmed with terror and plunged her into deep depression. The room around her filled with the stench of what she described as burnt excrement. These horrifying episodes led Anneliese to believe she was possessed by a demon. There seemed no other explanation for the grotesque images and sensations haunting her. Soon, voices invaded her mind, taunting her with threats of eternal damnation, telling her she would boil in hell. In June 1972, after suffering yet another seizure, her neurologist prescribed Dilantin, a drug commonly used to treat grand mal epilepsy. Despite the medication, Anneliese continued to see demonic faces and smell foul odors. Her seizures often left her body stiffened and her mind blank, with no memory of what had occurred. By early 1973, the torment escalated. Anneliese began complaining of strange knocking sounds coming from her closet, the floor beneath her room, and even the attic. One day, her aunt found her in the living room, standing before a statue of the Virgin Mary. Her face was contorted into an expression of pure hatred, and her eyes had turned pitch black. In the fall of 1973, Anneliese confided in her psychologist that her depression had grown so severe that she often contemplated suicide. Hoping to provide some relief, her father arranged a pilgrimage to the Chapel of the Virgin Mary in San Damiano, Italy. But the trip only deepened their fears. Upon arriving at the chapel, Anneliese claimed her feet were burning and refused to enter. She couldn't drink the holy water or even look at the sacred icons and sacraments. At one point, she tore a medallion from the neck of Tia Hein, a close family friend who had organized the trip. Everyone nearby noticed an unbearable stench emanating from her. Despite the failed pilgrimage and Anneliese's increasingly erratic behavior, she and Tia grew closer. Tia began praying for her and recalled Anneliese saying that the world would soon come to understand the reality of hell and the devil. Tia became convinced that Anneliese's suffering was caused by demonic possession. The neurologist's diagnosis of epilepsy no longer made sense to her. Determined to help, Tia sought out a priest willing to perform an exorcism. Most priests she approached dismissed the idea, insisting that Anneliese needed medical care. Eventually, Tia contacted Father Adolf Rodvik, a respected exorcist and author on the subject of demonic possession. Though he agreed that Anneliese's case seemed like genuine possession, he declined to help because he lived far away in Frankfurt. Undeterred, Tia reached out to Pastor Ernst Alt in a nearby town. Upon meeting Anneliese, Pastor Alt reportedly remarked that she doesn't look like an epileptic. Father Ernst Alt and Father Karl Roth, along with several other priests, held multiple meetings to discuss Anneliese's condition. A few weeks before meeting her, Father Alt received 2 letters, one from Anneliese and the other from her mother, Anna. The moment he touched the letters, he experienced something inexplicable. He felt physically ill, gripped by a strange mix of excitement and foreboding. That evening, he was unable to attend church and was haunted by the pungent stench of something burning. The oppressive feeling lingered until 5 a.m. the next day, when Father Alt shared his experience with other priests. They, too, reported smelling the same foul odor. 2 weeks after his first meeting with Anneliese, Father Alt described her as a modern, intelligent, and deeply religious young woman who was also remarkably honest. Despite her struggles, she enrolled in the University of Würzburg in the fall of 1973, where she studied pedagogy, music, and theology. Father Alt visited her regularly, providing spiritual support as she battled her depression and the relentless appearances of demonic faces that tormented her. In November, Anneliese met Peter, a fellow student. The two grew close, and by December 1973, she confided in him about her condition. She explained how her depression was intertwined with the horrifying dead faces she saw and the nauseating smells she endured. Around this time, Anneliese sought help from both her neurologist and psychologist in Würzburg. The psychologist concluded that she was suffering from psychosis, possibly stemming from her domineering father and subconscious resentment toward her mother. He attributed her seizures to epilepsy. Meanwhile, her neurologist switched her medication from Dilantin to Tegretol. By March 1974, Anneliese revealed to Father Alt that she was sometimes unable to pray, a revelation that troubled her deeply. Father Alt continued to pray for her during his visits, and she always reported feeling some relief afterward. However, he believed that her experiences, both physical and emotional, could not be fully explained by epilepsy alone. Her letters to him painted a vivid picture of her despair. She described being trapped in trance-like states and feeling an overpowering aversion to confession, which prevented her from receiving communion. In September 1974, Father Alt wrote to Bishop Josef Stangl of Würzburg, requesting permission to perform an exorcism if Anneliese's condition worsened further. The bishop denied the request, advising that Anneliese focus on leading an even more devout life to find peace. But the seizures continued unabated, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic and chaotic. In January 1975, Anneliese Michel began to unravel further. She lost her appetite, barely eating, and spent entire days confined to her bed. Quietly, she confided in Peter, her boyfriend, about a voice she had started hearing. The voice told her something chilling. She was damned forever. She couldn't understand why, but the idea gripped her with absolute terror. By the summer of 1975, things escalated. Anneliese wrote a desperate letter to Father Alt. She longed for the company of her sister, Roswitha, and Peter, but something inside her resisted. She admitted feeling an uncontrollable urge to lash out, to hit them or throw things at them whenever they were near. Even worse, the prayers and blessings that had once given her relief no longer worked. She begged the priest for help. Unable to assist directly, Father Alt sent another priest, Father Rod, to pray with her. But the moment Rod began, Anneliese's despair erupted. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed she couldn't pray anymore. Then something darker took over. She stood abruptly, her posture tense and defensive, and ripped apart her rosary. In a guttural, otherworldly voice, she demanded the priest leave. Alarmed, Rod called her parents and urged them to take her home. Back at the Michel family home, Anneliese's condition worsened. Her legs stiffened, making it nearly impossible for her to walk. The inability to pray continued to haunt her. When Father Alt visited, the oppressive atmosphere of the house was undeniable. A rancid smell of burnt earth seemed to seep from the walls, following him wherever he went. For a week, Anneliese remained confined to her home. Her mother, desperate to lift her spirits, asked Peter to take her for a drive. They left Klingenberg and wandered down a quiet country road. Peter encouraged her to walk, but her legs barely moved. Then, without warning, she collapsed to her knees and fell into what appeared to be a trance. Peter tried shaking her, calling her name, but nothing worked. Minutes passed like hours until Anneliese suddenly stood up, her face alight with joy. "I can walk," she exclaimed. Peter was stunned, watching as Anneliese moved freely for the first time in weeks. When he asked her what had happened, she claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary. In her vision, Mary had asked her a haunting question. Would she offer her suffering as a sacrifice for the sins of the clergy and the youth of Germany? Thrilled by what she saw as a miracle, Anneliese and Peter hurried back home to share the news. She told her mother she felt free, completely liberated from her torment. But her reprieve was short-lived. Just 1 week later, she told Peter her condition was going to worsen again. Despite the warning, Anneliese returned to Würzburg to enroll for the next semester. But when Peter went to check on her, he found her in her room, standing before a crucifix. Her face was contorted with rage, her lips pulled back in a snarl, and she was growling like an animal. Alarmed and unable to reason with her, Peter brought her back to Klingenberg that same day. At home, the nightmare continued to spiral. Anneliese screamed for hours on end, her voice ragged yet unrelenting. The screams would echo through the house until the early hours of the morning, when exhaustion would force her to sleep for maybe an hour or two. Her knees, battered and swollen from incessant kneeling, told the story of her torment. When the screaming stopped, new horrors emerged. Anneliese would convulse violently, her body locking up as if her muscles were steel cables stretched to their limit. She often fell unconscious, only to wake in a daze, her behavior even more bizarre. She refused solid food and barely touched water. Yet, Somehow she managed to swallow spiders and flies, horrifying her family. On the kitchen floor, she urinated openly and sometimes, shockingly, licked it up. Once, she even bit the head off a dead bird. Her actions grew more animalistic. There were times she crawled under the table and stayed there, barking like a dog for 2 whole days. Her loved ones tried to stay composed, but fear and helplessness shadowed their every move. Then came the violence. Anneliese tore saintly images from the walls, shredded rosaries, and hurled crucifixes with unnerving strength. Peter, her boyfriend, recounted an unsettling incident. She picked up an apple, gripping it lightly in her hand. Then, with no apparent effort, the fruit exploded, sending shards flying across the room. Dark thoughts of suicide plagued her mind. Yet, in rare moments of lucidity, Anneliese confided to Peter that her late grandmother and her deceased sister, Martha, would sometimes appear to comfort her. Even as she endured unexplainable wounds on her legs, she adamantly denied causing them herself. Her family tried to monitor her around the clock, taking shifts to prevent her from harming herself or others. But the situation became unbearable. Desperation led them to reach out to Fathers Alt and Adolf Rodwick, who had been closely following her case. In early September, Father Rodwick decided to visit the Michel family to see for himself what they were dealing with. During his visit, he attempted something unconventional. He placed Anneliese into a hypnotic trance. His voice was steady as he asked, "What is your name?" The response was immediate and chilling. In a guttural, altered voice, she spat out one word: "Judas." Before Rodwick could react, Anneliese suddenly slapped him across the face. Then, as if nothing had happened, she calmly walked over to the piano and began playing, her fingers moving with precision and ease. But her bizarre and horrifying behavior didn't end there. Despite being visibly hungry, she sometimes found herself unable to open up her mouth or swallow food. This strange condition began occurring more frequently, much to the alarm of her family, who watched helplessly as Anneliese descended further into darkness. Father Adolf Rodwick had seen enough. The chilling behaviors he had witnessed convinced him beyond doubt. Anneliese wasn't just sick, she was possessed. Determined to take action, he convened a meeting with Father Ernst Alt and Father Rod. The 3 priests deliberated and agreed that the situation had escalated to the point where an exorcism was the only option. Father Alt, who had been deeply involved in Anneliese's case, was tasked with writing to the Bishop of Würzburg, Joseph Stangl, to request official permission for the ritual. Father Alt recommended Father Arnold Renz, a deeply pious priest known for his unwavering faith, as the ideal candidate to perform the exorcism. Father Renz accepted the responsibility, and on September 16, 1975, Bishop Stangl granted the long-awaited permission. The ritual would follow the Rituale Romanum, a 16th century text still in use for exorcisms. A week later, on September 23rd, Father Renz met Anneliese for the first time. Contrary to the horrifying accounts he had heard, she appeared modest, polite, and deeply religious. Nothing about her demeanor suggested possession, but that calm exterior wouldn't last. On September 24th, 1975, the first exorcism session began. The second floor of the Michel family home was crowded. Present in the room were Fathers Renz, Alt, and Rod, along with Anneliese's parents, her sisters Roswitha and Barbara, her friend Peter, and a family friend, Tia Hein. At first, Anneliese was eerily calm, sitting quietly as if waiting. But the calm shattered the moment holy water was sprinkled on her. Her body convulsed violently, her face contorting with pure rage. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Despite being restrained by 3 grown men, Anneliese thrashed wildly, screaming with an unnatural guttural intensity.
"Take that shit away! Stop that shit!"
she growled, her voice warped and unrecognizable as her own. For over 3.5 hours, the priests prayed and fought to maintain control. Later, when asked what she experienced, Anneliese gave a chilling description. She said she was fully aware of her actions, but it felt as though she were standing on the sidelines, powerless to stop the demons that had taken over her body. Father Renz later described it as if an unseen force was shaking her like a rag doll, her movements unnatural, and her strength far beyond what her frail body should have allowed. After the first session, the group decided to record subsequent exorcisms. Over the next 10 months, they conducted 67 sessions, filling 42 audio tapes with the terrifying sounds and conversations of Anneliese's possession. As the sessions progressed, 6 demons revealed themselves: Judas, Lucifer, Cain, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and a disgraced priest named Flashman. The demons didn't just speak, they argued. They bickered about theology, mocked the clergy, and sometimes even debated secular topics. One particular session stood out. Father Renz brought 3 glasses of water into the room. One contained holy water from Lourdes, another from San Damiano, and the third was just plain tap water. Without hesitation, Anneliese pointed at the glass from San Damiano and sneered,
"Lynch water?"
before drinking the tap water instead. Another time, she declared in a chillingly confident tone,
"I can speak any language, but you can speak to me in German."
Anneliese's knowledge of languages was unnerving. When Father Renz, who usually read Latin prayers from a book, began speaking Latin from memory, Anneliese interrupted, correcting him on a mistake and dismissing his attempts.
"Latin is no good for you, Father."
She even responded accurately to questions posed in Dutch and Chinese, languages she had no reason to know. Father Renz, a former missionary in China, was particularly shaken by her fluency in Chinese. The demons' voices were distinct, each with unique intonations and mannerisms. Lucifer's voice was especially malevolent. He proclaimed,
"The bitch in heat is ours. You must pray much more. This will last at least another half a year."
The sheer cruelty in his words sent shivers through the room. Despite enduring relentless exorcisms and violent seizures, Anneliese somehow managed to maintain the appearance of a normal life. She continued her studies, worked on her thesis, and even found moments of calm amid the chaos. But beneath the surface, her ordeal was far from over. On October 13, 1975, everything changed. Anneliese claimed that the Virgin Mary had begun speaking directly to her. The messages were urgent, and Mary insisted Anneliese write them down and pass them along to Father Renz. Committed to her faith, Anneliese began keeping a diary, meticulously documenting the words of the Virgin Mary. For a brief period, the exorcism sessions seemed to settle into an eerie calm. November and December passed without incident, and in early 1976, the sessions were so uneventful that even the priests described them as boring. The demons who had once taunted and mocked had grown strangely silent, their voices replaced by nothing but convulsions racking Anneliese's body. By late February, her condition worsened. Simple tasks, like traveling home for the weekend, became impossible. On multiple occasions, her body would seize up, becoming so stiff and heavy that even several men couldn't lift her into a car. Terrified of being declared insane and sent to a mental institution, Anneliese confided in her family friend, Tia Hein. She made Tia promise to prevent anyone from calling a doctor on her behalf. The fear of losing her autonomy was almost as overwhelming as the torment she endured. In April, she told Father Alt something chilling.
"July will bring the end of my condition."
The events of Holy Week in 1976 brought Anneliese closer to what she believed was her destiny. On Holy Thursday, she visited the church to pray, but was overcome by an uncontrollable sweat soon after kneeling. She returned to her room, spending the night on the floor, unable to sleep. The next morning on Good Friday, Anneliese went back to the church and stayed after the service. Hours later, a friend found her in a trance-like state, eyes shut tight, clutching a prayer book in her hands. Alarmed, the friend called Peter for help. When he arrived, Anneliese was still unresponsive. She didn't answer his questions or react to his presence. It wasn't until midnight that Peter managed to coax her home. When she finally spoke, Anneliese told Peter what had happened. She now understood the depth of suffering that Jesus had endured. the realization weighed heavily on her, and her condition continued to spiral. Her family, desperate for help, decided that Anneliese should stay with Father Alt for a while. But even under his care, her suffering intensified. She refused food, opting instead to sleep on the floor, and would moan and scream for hours on end. Her resolve, however, remained unshaken. One day, she looked Father Alt in the eyes and said with chilling certainty,
Now I know what will happen. I know that the coming summer will be painful and terrible, and I know that I will not survive. No one can convince me otherwise. I will not survive.
Her voice carried no fear, only resignation. It wasn't a guess or a plea for help. It was a statement of fact. Anneliese Michel's life was a chilling contradiction. When she wasn't battling the attacks that had consumed her for years, she was cheerful, pleasant even, but it was always temporary. One moment she seemed fine, the next, her body and mind were gripped by something dark and uncontrollable. By late May 1976, Anneliese's condition had reached a terrifying new low. She returned to her family home in Klingenberg, but the horrors followed. She barely slept, couldn't eat, and when she did, she couldn't keep food down. Her eyes became sunken, ringed by deep blue circles, and her body weakened to the point of collapse. Even more concerning, she began injuring herself. Her family, desperate to protect her, resorted to tying her up. It was during this time that Father Alt's friend, Dr. Richard Rode, decided to witness one of the exorcism sessions for himself. Dr. Rode had listened to recordings of the sessions before, and what he heard had shaken him to his core. A man of science, he confessed to Father Alt that the tapes had rekindled his faith and made him pray again. But hearing was one thing, he needed to see it with his own eyes. On May 30th, 1976, Dr. Rode attended a session. When he saw Anneliese for the first time, he was stunned. By this point, Anneliese's condition had deteriorated beyond anything Father Alt had seen before. Her physical state was so fragile that the priest feared she wouldn't survive much longer. On June 8th, Father Alt visited for what would unknowingly be the last time he saw her alive. In a letter to the bishop, he described her in horrifying detail, her body riddled with wounds, her teeth shattered from biting into a wall. Despite this, the exorcisms continued under Father Renz until the end of June. Even in the depths of her torment, there were rare moments of clarity. Anneliese spoke normally to her family and her fiancé, Peter. According to Peter, she had always been resolute about her decisions, especially when it came to refusing medical intervention. She clung to one hope: everything would end in July. But as the summer dragged on, her condition only worsened. On June 27th, her fever spiked to nearly 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Her family managed to bring it down with cold compresses. Joseph called Father Alt, pleading for guidance. Alt urged him to call a doctor, but Anneliese refused medical help, terrified of being institutionalized. The next day, she stopped eating and drinking entirely. By June 30th, she was gravely ill. Her temperature soared again to over 39 degrees Celsius, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Surrounded by her family, she suddenly made a request. She wanted to receive her last communion. Father Renz administered the sacrament, and the family, emotionally drained, went to bed. Everyone except her mother, Anna, who stayed by her side. Anneliese's final words were whispered in the early hours of July 1st, 1976.
Mom, please stay with me. I'm scared.
At 8 a.m., Anna found her daughter lifeless. Anneliese was gone. Anna called Father Alt, who immediately contacted Dr. Rode. The doctor determined the time of death to be around 6 a.m., but there was a problem. Dr. Rode didn't have the necessary paperwork to issue a death certificate. The family called another doctor for help. When the second doctor arrived, he refused to issue the certificate, stating he couldn't confirm that Anneliese's death was due to natural causes. Her body bore too many unanswered questions. Anneliese Michel's story didn't end with her death. It only grew more haunting. What followed was one of the most infamous court cases in modern history. one that would blur the line between faith and science, belief and culpability. Anneliese's autopsy revealed the likely causes of her death: prolonged starvation and physical exhaustion. But the medical findings weren't enough to silence the questions swirling around her tragic story. A criminal investigation was launched, and the case quickly drew media attention. Crowds began to gather at Anneliese's grave, praying for her soul, convinced that her suffering had been something divine or something sinister. But for 2 years, the case lingered in limbo as prosecutors reviewed the evidence, grappling with the bizarre and unsettling facts. Finally, on July 13, 1977, Anneliese's parents, along with the 2 priests who had performed the exorcisms, Father Alt and Father Renz, were charged with murder by criminal negligence. The case became known as the Klingenberg case, and it set out to answer 2 chilling questions. What really caused Anneliese Michel's death? Who was responsible? The trial began on March 30th, 1978, in Aschaffenburg, and it immediately became a media spectacle. It was the most publicized German court case since the Nuremberg trials. The courtroom was packed, but the public wasn't on the side of the defense. Few people were willing to believe in the possibility of demonic possession. Interestingly, the Michel family didn't take the stand. Instead, it was Father Alt who painted a haunting picture of Anneliese's final days. He claimed she had accepted her suffering as a form of atonement for the sins of the clergy and the youth of Germany. To drive the point home, the defense played audio recordings of the exorcism sessions. The voices, grotesque and inhuman, filled the courtroom. The defense argued these tapes were undeniable proof of the devil's existence. Father Alt insisted that if they'd believed Anneliese's illness was purely medical, they would have sought help. But in their eyes, this was something far beyond medicine. He described the demons, how they identified them by their voices, intonations, and chilling words. The trial brought in witnesses and experts on both sides. Dr. Richard Rode, a key defense witness, took the stand 3 times, but his testimony was a disaster. Rode, who had once been convinced by what he'd seen and heard, now claimed to remember almost nothing. Father Alt later called his statements untrue and unhelpful. Father Renz, however, stood firm. He presented excerpts from the exorcism tapes and argued that no one had ever died from an exorcism before. His testimony painted a picture of a girl who had no free will when the demons controlled her. When the demons receded, she behaved completely normally. The prosecution's expert, Dr. Satis, offered a starkly different perspective. He detailed Anneliese's medical history, explaining that while medications like Dilantin had suppressed her seizures, her mental illness had taken on a new form. Satis argued that Anneliese suffered from psychosis, a delusion-driven condition. She had developed intense guilt and hallucinated the presence of the devil. And in his view, the exorcisms didn't help. They only deepened her psychosis, reinforcing her belief that she was possessed. As the trial wore on, the courtroom became a battleground between faith and science. The defense leaned on the recordings, chilling audio that seemed impossible to explain. Growls, guttural voices, and languages Anneliese had never studied spilled out of the speakers, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. The prosecution dismissed it as theatrics, nothing more than the manifestations of a mind tormented by illness. But the haunting question remained: could there really be something else at play here? By the time June arrived, it was already too late for Anneliese Michel. She was no longer the girl who could have been saved. And as her health deteriorated, the world watched, horrified, as the case unfolded. Before April, there had still been a chance. One of the priests could have stepped in, convinced her to eat, and maybe, just maybe, saved her life. But by June, Anneliese's fate was sealed. Dr. Satis, a key expert in the trial, proposed a drastic measure. He would have drugged Anneliese, put her on artificial nutrition, and even administered electroshock therapy. But Anneliese's sister had another perspective. She testified that Anneliese refused to be sent to a mental institution, terrified of being drugged and forced to eat against her will. It was a heartbreaking twist. A simple act of compassion could have saved her, but it never came. Dr. Felicity Goodman, author of The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, became a crucial figure in the case. Having access to the priests, the court records, and eyewitness testimonies, Goodman was able to point out significant flaws in Dr. Saddis's claims. Her work would become the definitive account of what happened, but not before the psychiatrist called by the defense added more fuel to the fire. According to the defense's experts, Anneliese's suffering was a result of her naive piety. They argued that her epilepsy led to schizophrenia, and in turn, her supposed demons were nothing more than the manifestation of her religious fervor. The two priests were portrayed as tragically misguided figures. They acted out of deep religious conviction, driven by primitive beliefs that clashed with modern medical understanding. But for them, the demons were all too real. The prosecution, determined to hold someone accountable, aimed to convict the priests of manslaughter by negligence. They pushed for fines, but not for Anneliese's parents. After all, they had already suffered enough. On the other side, the defense argued that Anneliese's refusal of medical treatment was a moral and constitutional right. She had placed her life in God's hands, and the priests were simply doing their duty. In the end, the court sided with the prosecution's medical experts. Anneliese's epilepsy had progressed into psychosis. By May, she was no longer capable of making rational decisions about her health. The exorcism had only worsened her condition. The court concluded that the defendants should have sought medical intervention, and they hadn't. The sentence was lighter than many expected. Each defendant was given 6 months in prison, later commuted to 3 years of probation. The two priests were fined, and they were all required to pay the costs of the trial. As the trial came to an end, Peter, Anneliese's friend, gave an interview to the BBC. His words struck a haunting chord. We really believed her when she said July 1st would bring change. Of course, we never imagined it would end like this. This is what happens when you're dealing with the supernatural. Almost 2 years after Anneliese Michel's death, the German Catholic Church declared she was not possessed. But for many, the mystery of her death remained unsolved. To this day, some still believe she died a martyr, her suffering an act of devotion to a higher cause. On February 25, 1978, Anneliese's remains were exhumed from the cheap coffin she had been hastily buried in. Her parents had insisted on moving her body, but many whispered that they weren't simply seeking a better resting place. They were desperate for proof. A nun had claimed in a vision that Anneliese's body was intact. When the body was uncovered, the official report stated that it was in an advanced stage of decomposition, as expected. Yet, Anneliese's parents were forbidden from attending the exhumation. Photographs of the body were never published, leaving the world to wonder. In 1974, just 2 years before Anneliese's audio recordings were made, The Exorcist hit German cinemas. The film's chilling scenes of possession and eerie voices sparked a wave of fear across the country. When people heard Anneliese's own voice in the exorcism recordings, they couldn't ignore the unsettling similarities to the growling, inhuman sounds of Linda Blair's portrayal in the film. Some skeptics began to suggest that Anneliese had been imitating the scenes from the movie, but there was no evidence she had ever seen it. Yet, even before the film's release, Annelieese had already exhibited symptoms that her family believed were signs of demonic possession. In 1999, more than 20 years after Anneliese's death, Cardinal Medina Estevez presented a revised version of the Rituale Romanum, the Catholic manual for exorcism. The new ritual underscored a growing obsession with possession in the modern world, but it came too late for Anneliese. Her mother never wanted to speak of the tragedy again. She refused to watch The Exorcism of Emily Rose, a film loosely based on her daughter's case, and Anneliese's father, Joseph, had passed away years earlier, leaving the world to speculate on the details of his daughter's death unanswered. To this day, Anneliese Michel's death remains a deeply divisive topic. The debate over whether she was truly possessed or simply a victim of untreated mental illness continues. Whether martyr, victim, or both, Anneliese's story still haunts the world, leaving us to wonder, was she truly the target of something supernatural? Or was it all just a series of tragic events that spiraled beyond control? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. If you found this story as chilling as I did, be sure to show your support by subscribing to the channel. It really helps out and ensures you won't miss more dark and mysterious tales like this one. Stay curious, stay cautious, and I hope to see you in the next video.